Have you ever felt like life just wasn't fair? Like people who should have had your back ended up hurting you the most? You were betrayed by someone you trusted, left broken, left to pick up the pieces, and you thought, God, why is this happening to me? Maybe you've even wondered if God was punishing you or if he had abandoned you in that moment of pain. Pain often feels like the last thing you would ever want to experience. It comes uninvited, it disrupts our plans, and it leaves scars that remind us of what we've been through. It's natural to ask, why me, when the pain is overwhelming? It's easy to see pain as the enemy, as something that's only meant to harm us. But what if pain wasn't just an obstacle in your path, but rather a tool in God's hands, shaping you into the person you were always meant to be? Pain, while hard to understand, often serves a greater purpose than we realize. It pushes us in ways that comfort never could. It's in the discomfort, the struggle, and the suffering that we truly grow. Pain has a way of stripping away the layers of pride, selfishness, and security that we've built around ourselves. It reveals parts of our hearts that we didn't even know existed. Sometimes the most important things we learn about ourselves are discovered in the seasons of our greatest pain. We live in a world that tends to avoid pain at all costs. We want to be happy, comfortable, and safe, but when we avoid pain, we also avoid the lessons it can teach us. It's in the trials and challenges that our faith is tested, our character is refined, and our trust in God grows stronger. When things are easy, it's easy to forget that we need God. But when we're in pain, we're forced to lean into him in ways we never would have if everything were perfect. Think about the people who have made a difference in the world, the ones who inspire us, the ones who speak truth with authority, the ones who have stories of overcoming incredible odds. Almost all of them have a history of pain. They've walked through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. And it's not that they were immune to the hurt. They were just willing to allow God to use that pain for a greater purpose. There's a certain strength that only comes from enduring pain. It's the kind of strength that isn't built by avoiding the hard things, but by confronting them head on. Pain molds you into a person who can empathize with others, who knows the weight of suffering and can speak to it with compassion. It transforms you into someone who doesn't just talk about faith, but who lives it out in the hardest moments. In fact, some of the greatest purposes are birthed from the deepest pains. It's when you're knocked down, when it feels like everything around you is falling apart, that you have the opportunity to trust God like never before. In those moments, you may not understand why it's happening, but you can know that God is present even in the midst of the hurt. He doesn't waste pain. He uses it to refine us, to equip us for the purposes he has planned. If you look back at the most painful moments in your life, you may be able to see how those times changed you. They didn't break you, they shaped you into something more. They made you more resilient, more aware of God's presence, and more in tune with what truly matters. Pain pushes us to reevaluate what we hold on to and forces us to let go of things that weren't part of God's plan for us. God has a way of turning what was meant to destroy us into something that strengthens us. It's in the deepest moments of despair that God often does his best work. When you can't see the way forward, when the road ahead seems impossible, that's when you find out just how deep your faith can go. When you lean into God's presence during the storm, you discover that he's been there all along, holding you up, sustaining you, preparing you for the next step. The pain you're facing right now may not make sense, but it's not without purpose. God will use it to stretch you, to grow you, and to prepare you for what He has in store. He doesn't cause the pain, but He will use it. He will take what the enemy meant to harm you and turn it into something beautiful. The purpose in the pain is not always obvious in the moment, but in hindsight, you'll see that God was working even when you couldn't feel it. Adversity has a way of pushing us beyond what we think we're capable of. It stretches us, pulls us out of our comfort zones, and forces us to face parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. At the time, it can feel overwhelming, even unbearable. It's hard to understand in the moment, but adversity is often the very thing that triggers growth in our lives. It's like a weightlifter pushing against resistance. The resistance is painful, but it's also what builds strength. Without it, there's no progress. We all love the idea of growth. We want to grow spiritually, emotionally, and even physically, but we often associate growth with ease, slow, steady progress where we feel comfortable and secure. Yet the truth is that growth through adversity is different. It doesn't come from smooth sailing. It comes from the storms that come crashing into our lives, throwing us off balance, forcing us to either sink or swim. It's when we're in the midst of a trial, a challenge, or a season of struggle that the potential for real growth is activated. Adversity forces us to confront our weaknesses. When things are easy, we can hide behind the illusion that we have everything together. We might believe we're stronger, wiser, or more capable than we really are. But adversity pulls away those illusions. It exposes areas of our character that need refining, whether it's impatience, pride, fear, or a lack of trust. It doesn't allow us to stay stagnant. Instead, it challenges us to grow in ways we never imagined. It's as if the adversity becomes a mirror, showing us who we truly are and inviting us to become something better. During difficult times, we often find ourselves questioning everything. Why is this happening to me? How much more can I take? But in those moments of questioning, God is often doing His most transformative work. When life doesn't go as planned, when everything feels like it's falling apart, we often discover that the pieces don't have to stay scattered. God can take brokenness and mold it into something stronger, more beautiful, and more resilient. One of the hardest truths about growth through adversity is that it often requires us to go through things we never would have chosen. We don't get to skip the hard parts, but it's in those hard parts that our true potential is realized. Think about it. If we were always comfortable, we'd never stretch. We'd never push the limits of our endurance. Pain, difficulty, and hardship are like a crucible, refining us, purifying us, and molding us into who God has called us to be. In fact, some of the most beautiful parts of the human spirit are shaped by adversity. The kindness that comes from someone who has walked through pain themselves, the compassion that is developed when we've been in the depths of suffering, the wisdom that emerges from having to make it through storms. All of these are birthed out of difficult circumstances. Growth through adversity doesn't just shape our outer circumstances, it transforms our hearts. Adversity also teaches us perseverance. There's a verse that says, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." James 1:04. The trials and hardships we face produce a perseverance that doesn't just get us through the moment. It prepares us for the future. It strengthens us for battles we haven't even encountered yet. When we come out on the other side of adversity, we are more resilient, more steadfast, and better equipped to handle the challenges life throws at us. Growth through adversity doesn't just happen on its own. It requires a mindset shift. Instead of viewing struggles as setbacks, we must begin to see them as opportunities for growth. We have to choose to see God in the midst of our pain, trusting that He is working things for our good, even when we can't see the full picture. It's a choice to allow the adversity to shape us instead of breaking us. When we make that choice, we begin to experience growth that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And it's important to understand that growth through adversity isn't always immediate. Often, we don't see the fruit of our growth until much later. The changes may be subtle, but they are there. The quiet confidence, the deeper trust in God, the new strength we carry. It's all a result of the adversity we've faced. Adversity also has the power to clarify what truly matters in life. When everything is stripped away, when the comfort, the security, the distractions are removed, it's often in that place of vulnerability that we find clarity. What seemed important before the trial might seem insignificant now. And what once felt like an insurmountable obstacle may now seem like just another part of the journey, a part that's shaping you into the person you need to become. Through adversity, we also learn to depend on God in deeper ways. We realize that we can't rely on our own strength, our own plans, or our own understanding. We learn to lean into Him, trusting that He is with us in the struggle. The more we depend on Him, the more we see His faithfulness, and the more we grow in our relationship with Him. Our trust in God is built in the fire of adversity, and when we come out on the other side, we're not only stronger, we're closer to the God who walked with us through it all. God's sovereignty is one of the most powerful yet often misunderstood aspects of His nature. It's the understanding that God is in complete control of everything, past, present, and future, and that nothing happens outside of His will or authority. In our human experience, it can be hard to grasp just how deeply God's sovereignty stretches, especially when things in our lives seem chaotic, uncertain, or even unfair. We look around at the world and the pain people endure, and we question, if God is truly in control, why does He allow suffering? But the truth is that God's sovereignty doesn't mean He causes every difficult thing we experience, but it does mean He is never absent, never surprised, and always in control, no matter what. When we understand God's sovereignty, we understand that He is the ultimate authority over all things. Nothing escapes His notice. Nothing catches Him off guard. This means that every moment of our lives, no matter how big or small, is known to God. He is not distant, passive, or disconnected from our struggles. He is actively involved in the world and in our lives, weaving a tapestry that we might not fully comprehend, but is ultimately for our good. It's this kind of sovereignty that assures us that even in the moments of pain and loss, God is still working in ways we may not immediately see. One of the most profound aspects of God's sovereignty is His ability to use everything, both good and bad, for His purposes. Think about the story of Joseph in the Bible. His brothers betrayed him, sold him into slavery, and he faced years of hardship. From a human perspective, it looked like his life was falling apart and that God had abandoned him. But in hindsight, Joseph saw that God was at work even in the midst of those dark moments. He said to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:20. God used what seemed like an evil act for a greater good, revealing that his plans are not hindered by human actions, no matter how destructive they may appear. God's sovereignty is not limited to the positive moments of our lives. It's easy to acknowledge God's control when things are going well, when we experience success, or when we feel his blessings. But God is sovereign even in the struggles, the trials, and the pain. Sometimes we can't see it in the moment, but God is still in control. He hasn't abandoned us. In fact, those very struggles may be part of his greater plan to refine us, teach us, and prepare us for what's ahead. The Apostle Paul speaks to this in Romans 8:28, where he reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." This is not just a comforting verse, it's a declaration of God's sovereignty. Even in the things that seem random, chaotic, or painful, God is at work. He is sovereign over the mess, and he will bring about something good from it. Another aspect of God's sovereignty is his eternal perspective. Our lives are confined by time, and we often get caught up in the immediate. We focus on the here and now, on the struggles of today, on the uncertainties of tomorrow. But God sees everything from an eternal perspective. He's not bound by time as we are. He knows the end from the beginning. His plan is not just for our temporary comfort, but for our eternal good. This perspective allows him to orchestrate events in a way that we can't always understand. His timing isn't our timing. His ways are higher than our ways. And even though we may not understand why things happen when they do, we can trust that God's timing is perfect and that his sovereignty covers every moment. God's sovereignty also means that we are never alone in the difficulties we face. When we face challenges, when the storms of life hit, we often feel isolated, abandoned, or forgotten. But God's sovereignty assures us that he is always with us. He hasn't left us to navigate life on our own. The psalmist writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing," Psalm 23:01. This isn't just a comforting metaphor, it's a statement of God's sovereignty over our lives. He is our shepherd, leading, guiding, protecting, and providing for us, even when we don't fully understand how. What's remarkable about God's sovereignty is that it's not just an abstract concept or a distant reality, it's deeply personal. His sovereignty extends to our lives in ways that bring us peace even in times of distress. Because he is sovereign, we can have confidence that we are not at the mercy of chance or random events. We are not victims of circumstances. We are his children, and he is in control of every detail of our lives. Whether we're experiencing blessings or walking through trials, God's sovereignty means that we are safe in his hands, and nothing can happen to us outside of his will. God's sovereignty also gives us a sense of purpose. When we understand that God is in control of all things, we can step into each day with a sense of meaning, knowing that he has a plan for our lives. We are not here by accident. We are not wandering aimlessly. Our lives are part of a greater story that God is writing, and our roles in that story are designed by him. This realization can give us peace when we don't have all the answers. And we don't need to know the full story because we trust the one who does. It's important to remember that God's sovereignty does not mean that He manipulates or controls every action we take. He gives us free will, allowing us to make choices. But even in our freedom, God remains sovereign. He works through our choices, guiding us according to His will, and He ensures that His ultimate purposes will be accomplished, even if we don't always see it or understand it in the moment. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful and transformative actions we can take, yet it is also one of the most difficult. We hear about it all the time in church, in books, and in conversations with others, but when we are the ones who are hurt, the concept of forgiveness can seem nearly impossible. The pain that we carry, the betrayal, the offense, the wound, feels so deep that it seems as though forgiving the person who hurt us would somehow invalidate our pain or make us seem weak. But forgiveness is not about ignoring or excusing the wrong that was done to us. It is not about pretending that what happened didn't matter. Rather, forgiveness is a deliberate decision to release the hold that the offense has on us and to trust that God will bring justice, healing, and restoration in His way and in His timing. When we forgive, we are not simply letting the other person off the hook. We are taking the power away from the offense. Holding on to unforgiveness is like carrying a heavy burden with no intention of ever putting it down. It weighs us down, keeps us tethered to the past, and prevents us from moving forward. In fact, unforgiveness is often more damaging to the person who holds on to it than it is to the one who committed the wrong. It eats away at our peace, our joy, and our mental health. It creates a prison of bitterness, anger, and resentment. Forgiveness is the key that unlocks that prison, allowing us to step out and experience the freedom that God intends for us. It's important to understand that forgiveness is a choice, not a feeling. It's not something that comes naturally, especially when the hurt is deep and the wound is fresh. Our emotions want to cling to the pain, to rehearse the wrong, to nurse the bitterness. But forgiveness is a conscious act of the will. We choose to forgive because we know that holding on to anger and hurt will only keep us stuck in a cycle of pain. And even though the emotions may take time to catch up with our decision, the act of forgiving begins the process of healing within our hearts. Healing, however, is a journey. Forgiveness is not a magic switch that immediately makes the hurt disappear. In fact, after we forgive, we might still experience feelings of pain, sorrow, and even anger. Healing is a process that takes time, and it's important to give ourselves grace in that process. It's okay to feel the emotions that come with the hurt. The goal is not to suppress those feelings, but to allow them to be transformed over time. Just as wounds need time to heal physically, emotional and spiritual wounds also require time and care. And just as we wouldn't rush the healing of a physical wound, we shouldn't rush the healing of the heart. God's way of healing involves both forgiveness and the active surrender of our pain to Him. We may think that if we forgive, we need to do it all on our own, or that we have to somehow be okay right away. But God invites us to bring our brokenness, our hurt, and our wounds to Him. He is the great healer. When we choose to forgive, we are not expected to simply forget the hurt or pretend that everything is fine. We are invited to surrender our pain to God and allow Him to heal us from the inside out. Sometimes the reason we struggle to forgive is because we believe that forgiveness means the same thing as reconciliation. But while forgiveness is a choice we make for our own well-being and freedom, reconciliation may not always be possible or healthy. Reconciliation requires both parties to be involved and willing to work toward restoring the relationship. Forgiveness, however, is between us and God. We forgive not because the other person deserves it, but because we have been forgiven much. Forgiveness is an act of obedience to God, who calls us to forgive as He has forgiven us. When we forgive, we are aligning ourselves with God's heart. Jesus, in His great love for us, demonstrated the ultimate act of forgiveness when He died on the cross for our sins. In the midst of immense pain and suffering, He said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Jesus shows us that forgiveness is not based on the actions or worthiness of the other person. It's based on the mercy and grace of God, which is extended to us freely. When we forgive, we participate in God's divine grace, and through that grace, we experience healing and freedom. Healing in the context of forgiveness also means letting go of the need for vengeance or justice in our own hands. It's natural to want to see the person who hurt us pay for their actions, but healing happens when we release that desire for retribution. When we trust that God is just, we can let go of the need to control the outcome. The Bible says that vengeance belongs to the Lord and He will repay. Trusting in God's justice means that we can forgive, not because the person who hurt us deserves it, but because we trust that God will make things right in His time. Forgiveness also means choosing to not let the past define us. When we continue to hold on to the pain, we allow the actions of others to control our present and future. The hurt becomes the lens through which we view everything, coloring our thoughts, our relationships, and even our self-worth. But forgiveness is the act of releasing the hold that the offense has on us, allowing God to renew our hearts and minds. When we forgive, we are no longer bound by the past. We are set free to walk in the healing that God offers, and we open ourselves to the fullness of life that He desires for us. Healing through forgiveness also restores our relationship with God. Unforgiveness can create a barrier between us and God, hindering our prayers and our ability to walk in the peace He promises. Jesus taught that if we do not forgive others, our Heavenly Father will not forgive us. Matthew 6:15. Forgiveness clears the space in our hearts for God's peace to reign. It opens the door to a deeper intimacy with Him, where we can experience His love, grace, and healing power. As we forgive and allow God to heal our hearts, we also begin to reflect the nature of God more clearly. Forgiveness and healing go hand in hand, and through them we become more like Christ, merciful, compassionate, and full of grace. Just as we have received His forgiveness, we are called to extend that same grace to others, releasing them from the debt of their offense. And in doing so, we step into the healing that God desires for us, experiencing His freedom and restoration in ways that only He can provide. A test of faith is one of the most challenging and transformative experiences in the life of a believer. It's when life throws its hardest curveballs and we are faced with circumstances that seem impossible, overwhelming, or even hopeless. In these moments, our faith is put to the test, not just in what we believe, but in how deeply we trust God, how strongly we rely on Him, and how committed we are to following Him, even when the road is rough. It's in these moments of difficulty and doubt that we often discover the true strength of our faith. Faith is not simply a mental assent to a set of beliefs or an abstract concept. It is trust, obedience, and dependence on God, especially when we cannot see the way forward. The Bible makes it clear that without faith it is impossible to please God, Hebrews 11:6. And yet the reality is that faith is often built through testing. It's in the hardest seasons of our lives that our faith is refined. The testing of our faith is not meant to break us. It's meant to build us. It's like the refining process of gold. Putting the gold through fire, melting it down, and removing the impurities. In the same way, God uses tests to refine our faith, to remove doubt, fear, and uncertainty, and to strengthen our trust in Him. One of the most well-known stories of faith being tested is that of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but after years of waiting, the promise seemed impossible. Then, when Abraham finally had the son that God had promised, God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac. In that moment, Abraham's faith was tested like never before. He didn't understand why God would ask such a thing, but he trusted God. His obedience, even in the face of an unimaginable command, showed that his faith was not dependent on his understanding or circumstances, but on his trust in God's character and promises. Abraham passed the test, and God provided a ram as a substitute for Isaac, showing that God is faithful even when we don't understand the reasons behind the tests He allows. When we face tests of faith, it's easy to feel like we're alone, like God is distant or absent. But the truth is, God uses these tests not to abandon us, but to draw us closer to Him. It's in our moments of weakness and struggle that we learn to rely on His strength. The Apostle Paul writes about this in 2 Corinthians 12:9, where God tells him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." When we go through trials and tests, we are forced to confront our own limitations, and it's in those moments that we are reminded that we can do nothing apart from God. The test of faith is not meant to expose our inadequacies, it's meant to reveal God's sufficiency. One of the most difficult parts of a test of faith is the waiting. God doesn't always answer our prayers or deliver us from trials in the way or the timing that we expect. We may be in a season of waiting where it feels like nothing is happening, where God seems silent, and where we question whether He's even listening. This is a test of faith in itself. Can we trust God when we can't see the answers? Can we continue to believe in His goodness and faithfulness even when the circumstances around us seem to contradict that belief? Waiting stretches our faith because it requires us to release control and trust in God's perfect timing. And in the waiting, our faith is refined as we learn to depend on Him rather than on our own plans or understanding. Tests of faith also often reveal what we truly value and what we truly trust. When everything is going well, it's easy to say we trust God. But when we're faced with difficulty, what do we lean on? Where do we turn for comfort, peace, or direction? A test of faith shows us what we are truly relying on. Are we relying on our own strength, our own resources, or are we trusting in God, who is the source of everything we need? Sometimes our faith is tested because God wants to expose these areas in our lives where we are still depending on ourselves rather than on Him. And in doing so, He is inviting us to let go of what we are holding on to and to trust Him more fully. Another aspect of the test of faith is that it often reveals areas of doubt, fear, and unbelief that we might not even realize we have. We may think we have a strong faith, but when we are tested, those hidden doubts can surface. And while this can feel discouraging, it's also an opportunity for growth. It's in those moments of doubt that we can ask God for help, just like the Father in Mark 9:24, who cried out, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." God is not angry with us when we have doubts. He is compassionate and ready to help us overcome them. The test of faith doesn't expose our weakness to shame us. It reveals it so that we can grow, heal, and be strengthened. Faith is not something that can be strengthened without testing. A muscle only grows when it is stretched, torn, and then rebuilt stronger. In the same way, our faith grows through testing. But the tests are not random or pointless. They are part of God's sovereign plan to shape us, to refine us, and to draw us closer to Him. God allows us to go through tests because He knows that on the other side, we will emerge stronger, deeper, and more dependent on Him. He doesn't test us to punish us. He tests us because He loves us and desires to see us become more like Christ. James 1:2-4 speaks to this reality, saying, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." This passage doesn't suggest that we should be happy about the pain or the difficulty, but it does encourage us to understand the purpose behind the test. The trials we face are producing something in us: perseverance, maturity, and a faith that is more refined and solid. When we understand that our tests are working for our good, we can face them with a different perspective. Finally, the test of faith also reveals how God is present in every moment. We may not always feel Him or see His hand at work, but He is always there. Even in the hardest tests, He promises to be with us, never leaving or forsaking us. Hebrews 13:05. The test is not just about what we endure, it's about learning to trust God more deeply, knowing that He is with us through every trial. And when we come out on the other side, our faith will be stronger and we will know God more intimately than we did before. One of the most difficult things to grasp in life is how pain and hurt can fit into God's grand plan for our lives. When we experience betrayal, loss, disappointment, or suffering, it's hard to see beyond the pain. Our immediate instinct is to ask, "Why me?" or "Why now?" The hurt feels overwhelming and the future seems uncertain. In these moments, we can be tempted to believe that the pain we're enduring is purposeless or that it will define us forever. But the reality is that God's plan for our lives goes beyond our current hurts, and He is always working in ways we cannot yet see, weaving every detail, every hurt, every tear into something much, greater. The Bible is filled with examples of people who experienced profound hurt, yet through their pain, God was working out a plan far beyond what they could understand in the moment. Take the story of Joseph. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of a crime, and thrown into prison. The pain of betrayal, abandonment, and unjust treatment must have been unbearable. Yet, as Joseph looked back years later, he could see how God had been orchestrating every event, even the painful ones, to position him in a place where he could save nations from famine. Joseph's pain was not in vain. It was part of God's bigger plan, and through it, God brought about deliverance for many. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph reflects on his life and says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This verse speaks to the powerful truth that even the worst of our circumstances are not beyond God's redemptive plan. God doesn't promise that we won't experience hurt or hardship. In fact, Jesus himself said in John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble." But he also doesn't leave us in the hurt. He's a God who works in and through our pain, using it to shape us, refine us, and position us for the future he has designed. The pain we face is often a part of the process of spiritual growth, building perseverance, character, and deeper trust in God. In Romans 5:3-4, Paul reminds us that we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. The hurt we experience is not meaningless. It is part of the refining process that brings us closer to the person God is calling us to be. God's plan for our lives is always for our good, even when it doesn't feel like it in the moment. We might not always understand how our pain fits into the bigger picture, but we can trust that God is in control and he is working everything for our ultimate good. The Apostle Paul, who endured his own share of suffering, writes in Romans 8:28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." This is not a promise that all things are good, but a promise that God works in all things, even the painful, hurtful things, to bring about his good purposes in our lives. What might seem like an obstacle or a setback can actually be the very thing God uses to propel us into his plan. It's important to recognize that God doesn't waste our pain. The hurt we experience often serves as a gateway to healing, growth, and transformation. The process of healing involves more than just moving past the pain. It involves being shaped by it. When we allow God to enter into our hurt, he uses it to form something beautiful in us. God can take our brokenness and use it for his glory, turning our scars into stories of his grace. There's a deep connection between our hurt and God's plan for our lives. And often, it's through our wounds that we can minister to others who are going through similar pain. God doesn't just heal us for our sake. He heals us so we can be vessels of healing for others. When we experience hurt, it's easy to think that it's the end of the road. But God has a way of taking what was meant to break us and using it to build us up. He's not caught off guard by our pain. He isn't absent in our suffering. In fact, he is very much present, working behind the scenes, preparing us for something greater. The prophet Jeremiah reminds us in Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Even when we are in the midst of pain, God's plans for us remain unchanged. His ultimate desire for us is not that we remain in the hurt, but that we move through it, stronger, wiser, and more in tune with his purpose for our lives. There's a profound truth in understanding that God is not surprised by our hurt. He knows the pain we are going through, and He is faithful to walk with us through it. In fact, Jesus Himself is no stranger to pain and suffering. He endured the ultimate hurt, the cross, so that we could experience healing. He understands our pain deeply, and His love and presence in our suffering are a source of comfort and strength. Isaiah 53:3 tells us that Jesus was a man of suffering, familiar with pain. He didn't remain distant from our hurt. He entered into it, experiencing it fully so that we might have the hope of healing and redemption. There's also a reality in knowing that God uses our pain to draw us closer to Him. It's in our moments of hurt that we often realize our dependence on Him. Pain has a way of stripping away the things we lean on for comfort, security, or strength, and it forces us to turn to God for healing, guidance, and peace. It's through these seasons of hurt that we discover the depth of God's faithfulness and love. In Psalm 34:18, we are reminded that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. God draws near to us in our pain, and through that nearness, we are able to experience His healing and restoration. The truth is, God's plan is always bigger than our current hurt. The pain we experience is not the final chapter of our story. It's a part of a much bigger narrative that God is writing. He is using every moment of our lives, the joyful and the painful, to fulfill His purpose for us. While we may not always understand how or why certain things happen, we can trust that God is good and that His plans for us are good. He is always at work bringing about His kingdom purposes even through our hurt. And though the pain may last for a season, God's plan for us is eternal. He will never leave us in our pain, but will bring us through it stronger, more refined, and more deeply rooted in His love than before. In conclusion, the journey through hurt, pain, and adversity is not one we walk alone. God's plan extends far beyond the struggles we face, using every moment to shape us, refine us, and draw us closer to Him. Our faith is tested, our character built, and our understanding of His sovereignty deepens as we navigate life's challenges. Though we may not always understand the why behind our pain, we can trust that God is always at work, bringing purpose, healing, and transformation through His grace. We emerge stronger with a deeper sense of His love and faithfulness.